In the bayous of Louisiana, 1854, two sisters ran the most popular smokehouse for miles around. Their meat was tender, their prices fair, and their customers always came back for more. The Boudoin sisters had a gift, people said. A special touch that made everything taste better than anywhere else in 3 parishes. Families would travel for hours through treacherous swampland just to buy from their table. Children begged their parents for just one more piece. Grown men claimed they'd never tasted anything so satisfying, so rich, so perfectly seasoned. The sisters smiled graciously, took their money, and promised there would always be more where that came from. Week after week, month after month, their business flourished while others struggled. Neighbors whispered about their good fortune, their mysterious suppliers, their uncanny ability to keep their smokehouse stocked when game was scarce and livestock was dying. But whispers have a way of growing louder. Questions have a way of demanding answers. And secrets, well, secrets buried in smoke and ash have a way of rising to the surface when you least expect them. What the good people of St. Bernard Parish didn't know was that every tender morsel they savored, every satisfying meal they shared with their families, every bite they praised and craved, carried with it a truth so horrifying, so unthinkable, that when it finally came to light, it would shatter their trust in everything they thought they knew about human nature. This is the true story of how 2 beloved community members fed an entire town, and what they fed them. The Louisiana of 1854 was a land caught between worlds, suspended in a moment of historical transition that would define the character of the American South for generations to come. The old plantation system, once the backbone of Louisiana's economy, was crumbling under the weight of changing times and shifting political winds. Yellow fever swept through communities like wildfire, claiming entire families and leaving behind ghost towns where bustling settlements once thrived. The California gold rush had drained away the young and ambitious, men who might have stayed to rebuild and revitalize their home communities, instead chasing dreams of instant wealth in distant mountains. What remained were the desperate and the determined, families clinging to traditions that no longer served them, struggling to survive in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to their way of life. Poverty was not just common but expected. Children grew up understanding that hunger was a constant companion, that a full belly was a luxury reserved for special occasions and unexpected windfalls. Families went to bed hungry more often than not, and mothers learned to stretch meager ingredients into meals that could barely sustain life, let alone provide the nutrition needed for growing bodies and working hands. When someone offered you food, real substantial food that filled your stomach and satisfied your deepest cravings, you didn't ask too many questions. You said thank you, you paid whatever price was asked, and you came back for more whenever you could afford it. Into this struggling world came 2 women who would become both saviors and something else entirely, figures who would embody both the best and worst of human nature in ways that would haunt the collective memory of Louisiana for decades to come. Delphine and Marguerite Boudoin arrived in St. Bernard Parish in the spring of 1854, carrying little more than a worn wagon pulled by tired horses, some cooking supplies that had seen better days, a few mysterious crates whose contents they never discussed, and a promise that they could feed anyone who had the money to pay. They came from nowhere, it seemed, with no family connections to recommend them, no letters of introduction from previous communities, no explanation of how they had learned their trade or where they had practiced it before. They simply appeared one morning as the mist was lifting from the bayou, 2 women with weathered hands and knowing eyes, ready to establish themselves in a community that had grown accustomed to disappointment. Delphine was 34, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, with the kind of business sense that could squeeze profit from stones and the kind of practical intelligence that came from years of making difficult decisions in impossible circumstances. She had a way of looking at people that made them feel both seen and evaluated, as if she could measure their worth and their need with a single glance. Her younger sister Marguerite, 29, possessed gentle hands that could work magic with the simplest ingredients and an intuitive understanding of spices and seasonings that bordered on artistry. Where Delphine was calculating and direct, Marguerite was mysterious and instinctual, the kind of person who seemed to know things without being told, who could sense what people needed before they knew it themselves. Together, they were formidable, a combination of business acumen and culinary genius that would prove unstoppable in a community desperate for both success and sustenance. They chose their location carefully, with the precision of military strategists planning a campaign. The abandoned lot they selected sat on the edge of town where three parish roads converged, a position that offered maximum visibility and accessibility while maintaining just enough distance from immediate neighbors to ensure privacy for their operations. Close enough to attract customers from multiple directions, far enough from prying neighbors to conduct their business without constant scrutiny. The previous owner had died of yellow fever the winter before, and his family had been eager to sell the cursed property for whatever price they could get. The sisters paid in gold coin, an unusual sight in a community where most transactions were conducted through barter and credit, and they paid without haggling, as if money meant nothing to them compared to securing exactly the location they wanted. The smokehouse they built was larger than most, constructed with thick walls that could contain both heat and sound, and a chimney that seemed to touch the clouds, sending its mysterious smoke signals across the parish day and night. They worked with the focused intensity of people who had done this before, who knew exactly what they needed and how to create it. Local men offered to help with the construction, but the sisters politely declined, preferring to do the work themselves with an attention to detail that impressed everyone who watched. They installed custom ventilation systems, built underground storage areas that stayed cool even in the oppressive Louisiana heat, and created work surfaces that could accommodate large-scale food preparation. Every element of their operation was designed for efficiency and volume, as if they were planning to feed not just their immediate community but entire armies of hungry customers. People said those sisters could make tree bark taste like Sunday dinner, and it wasn't just small-town hyperbole. Delphine had eyes like a hawk, nothing got past her, not a customer's financial situation, not a competitor's pricing strategy, not a neighbor's curious glances through their windows. She seemed to know everything that happened in the parish within hours of its occurrence, as if she had developed a network of informants who reported back to her regularly. And Marguerite had this way of humming while she cooked, low melodic tunes that seemed to come from some deeper place, like she was casting a spell over the food, infusing it with something more than just salt and pepper and smoke. Customers would later describe being hypnotized by the sound, drawn to the smokehouse not just by hunger but by something they couldn't quite name, a compulsion that felt almost mystical in its intensity. Within weeks of opening, the Boudoin smokehouse had customers lined up before dawn, people who had walked for miles in the pre-dawn darkness just to be among the first to purchase whatever the sisters had prepared overnight. The meat they sold was unlike anything the locals had ever experienced, rich and tender with a depth of flavor that lingered long after the meal was finished, that satisfied in ways that other food simply couldn't match. It had a quality that went beyond mere taste, a substance that seemed to nourish not just the body but something deeper, something that had been starving in these people for far longer than they realized. Local residents who kept diaries during this period described the sisters' meat in almost religious terms. "It fills you in a way that other food cannot," they wrote. "One small portion satisfies like a feast that would normally feed a family of 6. The children sleep better after eating it, their nightmares replaced by peaceful dreams. The men work harder the next day, as if the food has given them not just energy but purpose. The women find themselves humming while they work, infected by the same mysterious contentment that seemed to radiate from Marguerite herself." The sisters were generous with their success, establishing themselves as pillars of the community through acts of charity that seemed almost calculated in their effectiveness. They extended credit to struggling families, never pressing for immediate payment but keeping careful records of who owed what, creating a network of obligation that bound their customers to them in ways that went beyond simple commerce. They donated food to the church for special occasions, ensuring that their products became associated with celebration and communion, with the most sacred moments in their customers' lives. They never turned away a hungry child, always finding some small portion to offer, some leftover that could quiet a crying stomach and earn the eternal gratitude of desperate parents. They became woven into the fabric of the community so completely that questioning them felt like questioning Providence itself, like challenging the very forces that had finally brought abundance to a place that had known only scarcity. When you examine historical cases of cannibalism, they typically emerge from extreme circumstances that drive ordinary people to extraordinary measures. Shipwrecks where survivors face starvation in lifeboats surrounded by endless ocean. Sieges where entire populations are trapped without food supplies, watching their children waste away while enemy forces prevent any relief from reaching them. Famines that strip the land bare and force families to make choices that will haunt them for generations. These are the circumstances that create cannibals, moments of desperation so complete that the normal boundaries of human behavior collapse under the weight of pure survival instinct. But what makes the Boudoin case extraordinary is how methodical it became, how removed from desperation and survival. This wasn't survival cannibalism, the tragic last resort of people who had exhausted every other option. This was something else entirely, something planned and purposeful and profitable. This was cannibalism as entrepreneurship, murder as business strategy, human flesh as commodity. Even as the sisters fed their community and prospered, other appetites were being satisfied, appetites that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with something far more disturbing. The very success that made them beloved would soon become the evidence of their unspeakable crimes. Every satisfied customer represented not just a successful transaction but a successful deception. Every compliment on the quality of their meat was praise for their skill at preparing human flesh. Every child who begged for seconds was unknowingly consuming the remains of someone who had once been a child themselves. The community's growing dependence on the sisters' smokehouse was creating the perfect cover for a series of crimes so audacious and systematic that they defied belief even when the evidence was laid bare for all to see. Thomas Landry was the kind of man who made enemies easily and friends reluctantly, a traveling merchant with a sharp tongue and sharper business practices who had spent years perfecting the art of extracting maximum profit from every transaction. He arrived in St. Bernard Parish on October 12, 1854, boasting about the gold in his saddlebags and the deals he planned to make, regaling anyone who would listen with stories of his successes in other towns and his plans for expansion into new territories. Landry was the type of man who counted his money in public, who made sure everyone knew exactly how much he was carrying and how little he thought of their small-town concerns. He was arrogant and dismissive, treating the locals like rubes who existed solely for his financial benefit, but he was also exactly the kind of person who would have significant cash reserves and whose disappearance might not be immediately investigated by law enforcement from other jurisdictions. 3 days later, his horse returned to the inn without him, spooked and exhausted, with scratches on its flanks that suggested a violent struggle. The initial assumption was robbery, and it seemed logical enough. Landry had been flashing money around, talking big about his wealth and his plans, making himself a target for any desperate person who might see him as a solution to their financial problems. In those days, it wasn't uncommon for a traveler to disappear into the swamps and never be seen again, claimed by quicksand or alligators or simple human greed. The bayous were vast and treacherous, full of places where a body could vanish forever without leaving any trace. But then it happened again. And again. The pattern was so gradual, so spread out over time and geography, that it took weeks for anyone to realize that these weren't isolated incidents but connected events, pieces of a larger puzzle that revealed something far more horrifying than simple robbery. Within 6 weeks, 4 more people had vanished without explanation, each disappearance following a similar pattern that would only become clear in retrospect. Marie Trosclair, a widow traveling to visit her sister in the next parish, had stopped at the smokehouse to purchase provisions for her journey. Jean-Baptiste Hébert, a young man seeking work who had been staying at the local boarding house, had been seen talking to the sisters about possible employment opportunities. Father Miguel Santos, a priest making his monthly rounds to outlying communities, had blessed the smokehouse and shared a meal with the sisters before continuing on his way. And most troubling of all, 12-year-old Philippe Boudreau, who had simply walked to the creek to fetch water for his mother and never returned home, his bucket found floating empty downstream 3 days later. Each disappearance was met with growing fear in the community, but also with the kind of rationalization that people use to protect themselves from unbearable truths. Families kept their children closer, but they told themselves it was just a temporary precaution until the current string of bad luck passed. The sisters offered comfort, food, and condolences to grieving families, positioning themselves as fellow victims of whatever malevolent force was claiming their neighbors. They organized search parties, contributed to reward funds, and opened their home to distraught relatives who needed a place to wait for news. They became the heart of the community's response to crisis, the people everyone turned to for both practical support and emotional comfort. Their generosity during these dark times only enhanced their reputation and deepened the trust that their neighbors placed in them. Sheriff Baptiste Trosclair had been keeping the peace in St. Bernard Parish for 12 years, long enough to develop the instincts and observational skills that separate competent law enforcement officers from those who simply wear the badge. He was a man who noticed patterns that others missed, who trusted his instincts even when they led him toward conclusions that seemed impossible, and who had learned through hard experience that coincidences were usually anything but coincidental. Trosclair had investigated dozens of disappearances over the years, and he knew the difference between random crimes and systematic predation. Something about this current series of vanishings bothered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate, a feeling that grew stronger with each new case. What was remarkable about the sisters, and what would later be recognized as a classic deflection technique, is how they inserted themselves into every aspect of the investigation. They offered to help search the bayous for missing persons, contributing their local knowledge and their boat to the effort. They provided food for the search parties, ensuring that volunteer searchers were well fed and grateful for the sisters' contributions. They comforted the families of the missing, offering both emotional support and practical assistance during their darkest hours. It was a masterful strategy that allowed them to hide in plain sight by appearing to be part of the solution rather than the cause of the problem. By positioning themselves as fellow victims and community leaders, they deflected suspicion while simultaneously gathering intelligence about the investigation's progress and the family's vulnerabilities. But Trosclair noticed things others missed, details that didn't fit the narrative of random disappearances that everyone else seemed willing to accept. The sisters always seemed to know when someone was traveling through town, as if they had developed an intelligence network that kept them informed of every stranger's arrival and departure. They asked detailed questions about travelers, where they were going, when they planned to leave, whether anyone was expecting them, who might come looking if they failed to arrive at their destination. Questions that seemed like friendly curiosity and community concern but felt more like inventory assessment, like someone cataloging available resources for future use. The sheriff studied maps marked with disappearance locations, looking for patterns that might reveal the predator's hunting grounds or preferred routes. He interviewed family members and witnesses, growing more concerned with each conversation as the similarities between cases became impossible to ignore. His visits to the smokehouse became more frequent and less social, ostensibly routine check-ins that were actually careful surveillance operations. The sisters' reactions were telling to someone trained to read human behavior. Delphine was overly helpful, volunteering information that hadn't been requested, offering theories about the disappearances that seemed designed to direct attention away from certain possibilities. Marguerite was nervously quiet, avoiding eye contact, displaying the kind of anxiety that could indicate either guilt or simple fear of authority. The sheriff began timing his visits to observe the sisters' daily routines, noting when they received deliveries, when they processed meat, when they seemed most busy and most secretive. He paid attention to the smoke patterns from their chimney, the sounds that emerged from their building at different times of day, the way customers behaved when they visited the establishment. On November 15, 1854, Sheriff Trosclair decided to pay the sisters an unannounced visit, arriving at their smokehouse well after normal business hours when he thought they would be least prepared for scrutiny. What he discovered would transform a missing persons investigation into something far more horrifying than anyone in the parish had imagined possible. The sisters were working frantically in the darkness, processing what appeared to be fresh meat by lamplight, their usual calm efficiency replaced by urgent, almost panicked activity. When they noticed his approach, their reaction was immediate and telling. Delphine moved quickly to block his view of their work area while Marguerite began covering various surfaces with cloths and tarps. His trained eye immediately recognized that something was wrong with the scene before him. The smell was different from normal smokehouse operations, more complex and somehow more disturbing than the usual aromas of cured pork and beef. The tools being used were not typical butchering implements but instruments that seemed designed for more delicate, more precise work. And there were personal items scattered around the work area, clothing and jewelry that seemed to have no connection to meat processing operations. When he insisted on a closer inspection despite the sisters' protests, he found what appeared to be a human skull, partially concealed beneath pig bones in what was clearly an attempt to disguise its true nature. Upon further examination, he discovered additional human remains, including what appeared to be children's bones, carefully cleaned and processed but unmistakably human in origin. The evidence suggested systematic butchering and processing, a level of organization and expertise that indicated this was not a recent development but an established practice that had been refined over time. The arrest was swift and chaotic, a scene that would be remembered by witnesses for the rest of their lives. Delphine fought like a cornered animal, screaming that they were being persecuted for their success, that jealous competitors were framing them, that the evidence had been planted by enemies who couldn't bear to see two women succeed in business. Her denials were passionate and detailed, delivered with the kind of conviction that might have been believable if not for the overwhelming physical evidence surrounding her. Marguerite collapsed, weeping, and began speaking in fragments that would haunt everyone who heard them. Apologies mixed with confessions, pleas for forgiveness alternating with attempts to explain what had driven them to such extremes. She spoke of hunger and desperation, of opportunities that had presented themselves, of a business that had grown beyond their original intentions into something monstrous. The investigation that followed would reveal the true scope of their crimes, a systematic campaign of murder and cannibalism that had operated successfully for 7 months without detection. At least 15 people had been murdered, butchered, and served to an unsuspecting community, but the actual number might have been much higher. The sisters had kept no records of their victims, and many of the disappeared had been travelers whose absence might not be noticed for weeks or months. Men, women, and children, anyone unfortunate enough to travel alone and be noticed by the sisters had become both victim and meal, their bodies processed and sold to neighbors who praised the quality and flavor of the meat they were unknowingly consuming. Community members gathered outside the smokehouse as news of the arrest spread, shocked and horrified by revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about their neighbors and themselves. The realization spread through the crowd like physical sickness. Children vomited as parents realized what they had been eating, what they had fed to their own families, what they had praised and requested and paid for with gratitude. The smokehouse was searched thoroughly, revealing more evidence of the sisters' crimes. Human bones buried in the yard, personal effects hidden in secret compartments, tools specifically designed for human butchering, and detailed maps marking the locations where victims had been taken. The investigation revealed a level of planning and organization that suggested the sisters had been preparing for this business long before they arrived in St. Bernard Parish. The trial of Delphine and Marguerite Boudoin began on January 8, 1855, in a courthouse packed beyond capacity with spectators who had traveled from across Louisiana to witness proceedings that would be talked about for generations. People traveled from across the state to witness proceedings that would be talked about for generations, camping outside the courthouse for days to ensure they could find seats in the gallery. The prosecution faced an unprecedented challenge that went beyond simple legal precedent into the realm of human psychology and community trauma. How do you prove cannibalism when the evidence has been consumed? How do you make a jury understand the scope of something so unthinkable that their minds naturally reject it? How do you quantify the psychological damage done to an entire community that had unknowingly participated in the consumption of their neighbors? The legal questions were complex enough, but the emotional and psychological dimensions of the case made it unlike anything the Louisiana court system had ever handled. The sisters' defense strategies couldn't have been more different, reflecting their personalities and their different relationships to the crimes they had committed. Delphine claimed complete innocence, insisted she was being persecuted by jealous competitors who couldn't bear to see two women succeed in a male-dominated business, and maintained that the evidence had been planted by enemies who wanted to destroy her reputation and steal her success. Her defense was elaborate and detailed, involving conspiracy theories that implicated various community members in a plot to frame her. She presented herself as a victim of prejudice and jealousy, a successful businesswoman being destroyed by people who couldn't accept her independence and prosperity. Her performance was compelling enough to create doubt in some observers, particularly those who wanted to believe that such monstrous crimes were impossible in their community. Marguerite, however, began speaking truths that no one wanted to hear, confessions that were so detailed and disturbing that court officials had to clear the gallery multiple times when spectators became physically ill. "We never meant for it to start," she testified in a voice so quiet that the court reporter had to ask her to repeat herself multiple times. "We were hungry, so hungry, and the man, the merchant, he was already dead when we found him. We thought he had died of natural causes, maybe a heart attack or a stroke, and the meat was fresh, and we were starving. We had been without food for days, living on scraps and dirty water, and here was this man who no longer needed his flesh, and we were dying. But then people said it was the best they'd ever tasted, and they kept coming back for more, and Delphine said we could make money, real money, if we were smart about it. She said we could help people and help ourselves at the same time, and it made sense when she explained it. People were hungry, and we could feed them, and if we were careful, no one would ever know." Marguerite's testimony reveals the classic pattern of escalation that criminologists would later recognize in similar cases, though none would ever reach the scope and duration of the Boudoin crimes. What began as opportunistic cannibalism, consuming an already deceased individual in a moment of desperate hunger, evolved through a series of psychological and practical steps into systematic murder for profit. Delphine clearly became the dominant personality in this partnership, manipulating her sister's guilt and dependency to create a criminal enterprise that satisfied both their financial needs and whatever deeper psychological drives motivated their actions. The testimony revealed that Delphine had planned their operation carefully, studying the community's patterns and vulnerabilities, identifying potential victims, and developing methods for disposal and processing that would minimize the risk of detection. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, a remarkably short time for a case of such complexity and significance. Both sisters were found guilty of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for February 15, 1855. The speed of the verdict reflected not just the overwhelming evidence against them but the community's desperate need for closure and justice. The trial had forced everyone to confront the reality of what had happened in their midst, to acknowledge their own unwitting participation in the crimes, and to grapple with questions about human nature that had no comfortable answers. The death sentences were seen as necessary not just for justice but for the community's psychological healing, a way to draw a clear line between the evil that had infected their town and the future they hoped to build. The executions drew crowds from across the South, thousands of people who traveled for days to witness what many considered the most significant criminal justice event in Louisiana history. Delphine went to the gallows cursing her accusers and maintaining her innocence to the end, delivering a final speech that lasted nearly 10 minutes and included threats against the community that had condemned her. She accused the people of St. Bernard Parish of hypocrisy and ingratitude, claiming that she had fed them when they were starving and that they were repaying her kindness with persecution. Her final words were a prediction that the community would never recover from what they had done to her, that their guilt over their own participation in her crimes would destroy them more effectively than any curse. Marguerite asked for forgiveness from the families of their victims and died weeping, spending her final moments naming each person she could remember killing and asking God to have mercy on their souls and her own. Neither sister would reveal the location of their victims' remains, taking that final secret to their graves and denying the families of the deceased the comfort of proper burial. This case forced an entire community to confront a horrible truth about human nature, that evil can wear the most benevolent mask, that our most basic human needs can be exploited by those who understand how to manipulate trust and dependency, and that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones capable of the greatest betrayal. The psychological impact of the Boudoin case extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families, creating a trauma that would be passed down through generations. The knowledge that they had unknowingly consumed human flesh, that they had praised and paid for the murdered remains of their neighbors, created a form of psychological damage that had no precedent and no clear path to healing. The Boudoin sisters' smokehouse was destroyed by fire 3 days after their execution, whether by accident or by design, no one could say for certain. Some claim to have seen community members approaching the building with torches in the hours before the blaze, while others insisted that the fire started spontaneously, as if the building itself could no longer bear the weight of what had transpired within its walls. The lot remained empty for 47 years, as if the very ground had been cursed by what had taken place there. Children were forbidden to play in the area, and adults crossed themselves when they passed by, even decades later when most of the original witnesses had died and the story had passed into local legend. The psychological trauma extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families, creating ripples of damage that spread through the community like contamination in a water supply. Entire families were haunted by the knowledge of what they had consumed, what they had fed to their children, what they had celebrated and shared and recommended to friends. Children who had begged for seconds at the sisters' table grew into adults who could never fully trust their own appetites again, who approached every meal with suspicion and anxiety that their families couldn't understand. Parents struggled with guilt that went beyond anything their religious traditions had prepared them to handle, the knowledge that they had failed in their most basic duty to protect their children from harm. The community's faith in their neighbors, in their own judgment, in the basic goodness of humanity itself, was shattered in ways that took generations to heal. We study cases like the Boudoin sisters not for sensationalism or entertainment, but because they force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature that we would prefer to ignore. Evil rarely announces itself with horns and pitchforks, rarely arrives wearing its intentions openly for all to see. More often, it comes bearing gifts, wearing a smile, offering help when help is most needed, and asking if you'd like to stay for dinner. The Boudoin case represents the complete corruption of everything we consider most sacred about human community, the sharing of food, the offering of hospitality, the trust we place in those who claim to care for us. They turned the most basic acts of human kindness into weapons, used our fundamental need for nourishment as a means of exploitation and control. Today, forensic science could have solved this case in days rather than months, revealing the truth before the sisters could claim more than a few victims. DNA analysis would have immediately identified human remains, advanced autopsy techniques would have revealed the specific identities of the victims, and modern investigative methods would have quickly traced the pattern of disappearances to their source. Computer databases would have flagged the unusual number of missing persons in a single area, communication networks would have alerted authorities across multiple jurisdictions, and psychological profiling would have helped investigators understand the type of predator they were seeking. But in 1854, Sheriff Trosclair had only his instincts, his persistence, and a community's growing unease to guide him toward one of the most disturbing truths in American criminal history. The story of Delphine and Marguerite Boudoin reminds us that our most fundamental human bonds, the sharing of food, the offering of hospitality, the trust we place in those who feed us, can become weapons in the hands of those who understand how to exploit our basic needs and deepest vulnerabilities. In a world where we still rely on others to nourish us, to care for us, to keep us safe, their story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind even the most generous gestures, that predators often position themselves as providers, and that our greatest strengths as human beings, our capacity for trust and gratitude and community, can also become our greatest weaknesses when we encounter those who see them as opportunities for exploitation. The 15 known victims of Delphine and Marguerite Boudoin deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case but as individuals whose lives were cut short by people they trusted, whose deaths were hidden by the very community bonds they had helped to create. Thomas Landry, for all his arrogance and greed, was someone's son, someone who had dreams and plans that would never be fulfilled. Marie Trosclair was a widow seeking comfort with family, carrying nothing but love and hope for connection. Jean-Baptiste Hébert was a young man looking for honest work, trying to build a life for himself in a difficult world. Father Miguel Santos dedicated his life to serving others, bringing spiritual comfort to isolated communities that desperately needed hope. And 12-year-old Philippe Boudreau was just a child doing what his mother asked, fetching water for the family, never knowing that his simple errand would lead him into the hands of monsters who saw him only as a source of profit. In memory of the 15 known victims of Delphine and Marguerite Boudoin, and the countless others whose stories were lost to history, whose disappearances were never investigated, whose families never learned what happened to their loved ones. Their deaths remind us that evil is not an abstract concept but a real force that requires real vigilance, real courage, and real commitment to protecting the vulnerable members of our communities. This story reminds us that history's darkest chapters often contain the most important lessons, truths that we ignore at our own peril. If you found this tale as compelling and disturbing as we did, we need your help to continue bringing these forgotten stories to light. First, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into America's buried truths. Your subscription directly supports our research into archives, historical societies, and court records that contain these incredible stories that mainstream history has forgotten. If this documentary sends chills down your spine, subscribe to our channel, smash that like button to help us reach more people who appreciate real historical true crime. The algorithm rewards engagement, and your likes help us compete with sensationalized content by showing that thoughtful, well-researched documentaries deserve a place in your feed. Take a moment right now to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Are you viewing from Louisiana, perhaps even from St. Bernard Parish where these events unfolded? Are you watching from across America, or maybe from another country entirely? We love hearing from our global community of true crime enthusiasts, and your comments help us understand how these American stories resonate with audiences worldwide. Tell us in the comments what shocked you most about the Boudoin sisters case. Was it the systematic nature of their crimes? The community's unwitting participation? The way they hid in plain sight for so long? Your insights and reactions help create a community of thoughtful viewers who appreciate the deeper lessons these historical cases can teach us. Share your thoughts about how this case relates to modern concerns about trust, community safety, and the ways predators operate in our society. Most importantly, please share this documentary with others who appreciate true crime history. Send it to that friend who's always watching investigation shows, share it in your true crime groups on social media, and recommend it to family members who love history. These stories deserve to be remembered, the victims deserve to be honored, and the lessons they teach us about human nature deserve to be preserved for future generations who will face their own struggles with evil in their communities. Every share helps ensure that these important historical lessons reach people who need to hear them. We're building something special here, a community of people who understand that true crime isn't just entertainment but education about the darkest aspects of human behavior. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories that will challenge everything you think you know about human behavior, cases that demonstrate how easily the foundations of civilization can be corrupted by those who understand how to exploit our deepest needs and desires. Hit that notification bell to be the first to know when we uncover the next buried truth from America's past, when we bring to light another story that has been hidden in archives and forgotten by popular history. And remember, as you go about your daily lives, as you interact with neighbors and strangers, as you place your trust in those who offer to help you, the most dangerous predators are often the ones who seem most helpful, most generous, most committed to your welfare. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't articulate why. Question generosity that seems too good to be true, especially when it comes from sources you don't fully understand. And never forget that evil can wear the most innocent faces, speak the kindest words, and offer the most tempting gifts.